The celestial architects had existed since the beginning of time itself. They were not creatures of flesh and blood like the beings they watched over. They were made of pure thought and ancient mathematics. They existed as living equations, as patterns of energy that could fold space and reshape matter with nothing more than intention. For 3 billion years, they had built and maintained the universe with perfect precision. Every star burned exactly as they had designed it to burn. Every planet spun in exactly the orbit they had calculated. Every galaxy spiraled according to formulas they had written into the fabric of existence itself. The architects took great pride in their work. They had created a cosmos of perfect order, a machine of unimaginable complexity that ran without error or surprise. There were thousands of architects, each one responsible for different aspects of reality. Some managed the flow of time. Others maintained the laws of physics. A few specialized in the creation of new stars, while others carefully guided the formation of planets. They communicated through pure thought, sharing information instantly across distances that would take light millions of years to cross. The architects had observed countless worlds. They had billions of planets, noted the formation of primitive life on thousands of them, and watched with mild interest as simple organisms sometimes evolved into more complex forms. But they had never found anything that truly surprised them. The universe operated exactly as they had designed it to operate. There was comfort in that predictability. Then one of the younger architects discovered something strange. Seven was considered young by architect standards, having existed for only 400 million years. They had been assigned to monitor a small section of an unremarkable galaxy, a region containing a few thousand star systems that the older architects considered too boring to deserve much attention. Seven did not mind the assignment. Every part of the universe deserved careful observation, they believed, no matter how ordinary it might seem. It was during a routine scan of electromagnetic signals that Seven first noticed the anomaly. On a small blue planet orbiting a medium-sized yellow star, strange patterns were emanating from the sleeping brains of the dominant species. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants, and the species called themselves humans. At first, Seven dismissed the signals as random noise. Biological brains produced all sorts of electrical activity, most of it meaningless static created by chemical processes. But something about these particular patterns caught their attention. The signals were not random at all. They had structure. They had complexity. They had something that Seven had never encountered in all their centuries of observation. They had creativity. Seven spent several Earth months studying the phenomenon before they were certain of what they had found. When humans slept, their brains did not simply rest and repair themselves as expected. Instead, the humans generated entirely new realities inside their minds. They created worlds that had never existed and could never exist. They imagined impossible things with casual ease. They broke every law of physics the architects had carefully established, and they did it while unconscious. The humans called these mental creations dreams. Seven brought their discovery to the Grand Conclave, the gathering of the oldest and most powerful architects. They presented their data carefully, showing the readings they had collected, the patterns they had identified, the sheer impossibility of what the humans were doing inside their sleeping minds. The conclave listened in silence. For the first time in memory, the ancient architects had no immediate response. They examined the data. They checked and rechecked the calculations. They looked for errors in Seven's methodology. They found none. A single human child, asleep in a small bed on that distant blue planet, had generated more novel configurations of reality in one night than the entire conclave had produced in 1,000 years. A factory worker had dreamed of flying over mountains made from the sound of his grandmother's voice. A grieving widow had danced with her dead husband under a sky that wept tears of golden light. An elderly man had spoken with animals who gave him advice about his loneliness. A young woman had solved mathematical equations using colors that did not exist in the visible spectrum. The architects had built the universe according to strict rules. They had created order from chaos and maintained that order with absolute precision. Chaos was error. Unpredictability was failure. Surprise was a flaw in the design. But these human dreams were chaos that carried meaning. They were unpredictable in ways that seemed to serve a purpose. They were surprises that revealed truths rather than concealing them. The Grand Conclave authorized a full investigation. Over the following decades, thousands of architects descended upon Earth's sphere of consciousness. They made themselves invisible to human perception and slipped into the dreamscapes of the sleeping species. They watched and recorded everything they witnessed. They saw a soldier dream of the enemies he had killed, except in the dream the enemies wore his own face, and he realized they had feared death just as much as he did. They watched a mother dream of her sick child running healthy and strong through fields of flowers that sang when touched. They observed a scientist dream of particles that behaved like music and suddenly understand a concept that had puzzled her for years. The architects recorded a teenage boy's recurring dream about a purple dog that could walk through walls. They documented an old woman's nightly journey through a house that contained every home she had ever lived in, all connected by doors that opened onto different decades of her life. They dreams of falling that turned into dreams of flying, dreams of loss that became dreams of acceptance, dreams of fear that transformed into dreams of courage. Slowly, carefully, the architects began to understand what they were witnessing. Human dreams were not random malfunctions of biological hardware. They were translations. The universe itself was trying to speak through these fragile creatures, and the humans were chaotic enough, unpredictable enough, creative enough to actually listen. Their consciousness was not a byproduct of biological processes. It was a receiver, picking up signals that the orderly minds of the architects had never been able to detect. Seven worked tirelessly to compile the findings. They cross-referenced dreams with human behavior, tracking how nighttime visions influenced daytime decisions. They found that humans who remembered their dreams were often more creative, more adaptable, more resilient. They discovered that cultures which valued dreams had developed richer art, deeper philosophy, more innovative solutions to difficult problems. The implications troubled even the youngest architects. For 3 billion years, the celestial architects had believed themselves to be the masters of reality. They had assumed that consciousness was their invention, that meaning was their creation, that the universe was a machine they had built and could therefore fully understand. They had never questioned these assumptions because there had never been any reason to question them. But human dreams suggested a different truth. Dreams implied that consciousness wanted to exist independently of the architect's designs. Dreams suggested that the universe was not merely a machine to be maintained, but a story trying to tell itself through whatever vessels it could find. Dreams hinted that the architects, for all their power and precision, had missed something fundamental about the nature of reality. The study continued for 300 Earth years. During that time, the architects observed hundreds of millions of dreams across every human culture and time period. They watched as humans used their dreams to process grief, to solve problems, to rehearse challenges, to explore possibilities that waking reality would never permit. They saw dreams shared between lovers who had died decades apart. They witnessed children dreaming of ancestors they had never met. They documented the strange way that certain dreams seemed to spread between unconnected people, as if ideas could flow through the sleeping minds of the entire species. When the study finally concluded, the architects who had conducted it were no longer the same beings who had begun it. Something had changed in them, though they struggled to define what. They had spent 3 centuries immersed in human chaos, and that chaos had left its mark. Seven prepared to present the final findings to the Grand Conclave. The data was clear. The conclusions were inescapable, and the decision that the conclave would have to make would determine the fate of both species and perhaps the universe itself. The question was simple but terrifying. Had the architects been building reality correctly all along? Or had they, in their pursuit of perfect order, made the cosmos smaller and more limited than it was meant to be? The dreams of humanity suggested an answer that the architects were not certain they wanted to hear. Seven stood before the Grand Conclave, with their findings compiled into patterns of pure light that floated in the vast space between the assembled architects. 300 years of research condensed into data streams that pulsed with meaning. But when seven began to speak, their words came slowly. Something had changed in them during the long study, and they struggled to express concepts that once would have been simple to articulate. The data was clear and undeniable. Human dreams contained solutions to problems that the architects had struggled with since the dawn of creation. Hidden within nightmares were algorithms for revering entropy, the universal tendency toward disorder that the architects had fought against for billions of years. Buried in the soft fantasies that accompanied lullabies were mathematical frameworks for creating stable passages through space and time. A teenage girl's recurring dream about swimming through clouds had accidentally mapped the structure of dark matter. An elderly farmer's vision of talking corn had contained a formula for generating energy from quantum fluctuations. But the most disturbing discovery was not the solutions themselves. It was what those solutions implied about the nature of reality and the role of the architects within it. The conclave erupted into the closest thing architects could experience to argument. Ancient beings who had existed since the birth of stars challenged each other's interpretations of the data. Young architects like Seven offered perspectives that the elders found troubling. For the first time in living memory, the conclave could not reach immediate consensus. One faction quickly formed around one of the oldest architects still in existence, had helped design the fundamental laws of physics. They had written the equations that governed the behavior of subatomic particles. They had been present when the first stars ignited and the first galaxies began to spin. In all that vast time, had never doubted the rightness of the architect's work. Dreams were dangerous, argued. They were infectious irrationality that threatened the stability of existence itself. The architects had spent billions of years creating order from chaos. They had built a universe that functioned with perfect precision. Now this young architect was suggesting that chaos might have value, that unpredictability might serve a purpose, that disorder might be something other than error. Proposed a solution. The architects should sterilize Earth's sphere of consciousness. They should lock human minds into purely logical patterns, eliminating the capacity for dreaming entirely. The humans would still function. They would still live their brief lives and build their small civilizations. But they would no longer produce the strange signals that had caused so much confusion among the architects. Better to lose the dreams than risk contaminating the cosmos with irrationality. Several of the older architects signaled their agreement. The universe had operated smoothly for 3 billion years. Why change something that worked perfectly well? Human dreams were interesting, perhaps, but they were also threatening. They suggested possibilities that the architects found uncomfortable to consider. Eliminating them would restore order and peace of mind. But Seven refused to accept this conclusion. They had spent 300 years immersed in human dreams. They had watched countless people create impossible beauty while they slept. They had seen grief transformed into acceptance, fear transmuted into courage, despair converted into hope. They had observed the way dreams allowed humans to process experiences that their waking minds could not handle. They had witnessed the creative explosions that followed particularly vivid dreams. And they had begun to suspect that the architects themselves had lost something essential, something they had never possessed in the first place. We have maintained perfection for 3 billion years, Seven argued, and in all that time we have never once surprised ourselves. We have never created anything that we did not already understand. We have never wondered about what might be possible. We have never experienced the joy of unexpected discovery. Is that truly perfection? Or is it simply the absence of growth? The question hung in the space between the assembled architects. No one knew how to answer it. The concept of growth was foreign to beings who had been essentially unchanged since the beginning of time. The idea that perfection might be a form of stagnation was deeply unsettling to entities who had devoted their existence to maintaining perfect order. Dismiss the argument. Perfection was perfection. Order was preferable to chaos. These were fundamental truths that did not require debate. The humans and their dreams were anomalies, errors in the fabric of existence that should be corrected rather than studied. But other architects were not so certain. A faction began to form around 7, composed mostly of younger architects but including a few of the older ones as well. They had reviewed the data. They had seen the solutions embedded in human dreams. They had noticed something that troubled them deeply. In 3 billion years of existence, the architects had never produced anything genuinely new. They had maintained and managed and preserved, but they had never truly created. The universe had been designed at the beginning of time, and since then, the architects had simply kept it running according to the original specifications. Humans had existed for barely a heartbeat in cosmic terms, yet in that brief time, they had generated more genuine novelty than the architects had managed in eons. Every night, billions of humans closed their eyes and built new worlds from nothing. They invented things that the architects could not have imagined. They broke rules that the architects had considered unbreakable. The debate continued for what felt like centuries to the architects, but was only moments in human time. Arguments were presented and challenged. Data was analyzed and reanalyzed. Ancient assumptions were questioned for the first time in memory. Finally, a compromise emerged. It satisfied no faction completely, but it offered a path forward that avoided the extremes of either destruction or inaction. The architects would not eliminate human dreams. They would not sterilize Earth's sphere of consciousness. Instead, they would learn from what they had observed. They would study the principles that governed human creativity, and they would attempt something unprecedented in their entire existence. They would redesign reality itself to incorporate the logic of dreaming. The decision sent shockwaves through the conclave. Never in 3 billion years had the architects considered modifying the fundamental structure of the universe. The laws of physics had been established at the beginning of time and had remained unchanged ever since. To alter them now, based on the sleeping visions of a primitive species, seemed like madness to many of the older architects. But the decision had been made. The work would begin immediately. 7 was assigned to lead the redesign effort. They chose their team carefully, selecting architects who had demonstrated openness to new ideas and flexibility in their thinking. They studied human dreams with renewed intensity, searching for the underlying principles that governed them. They looked for patterns that could be translated into cosmic law. What they found surprised them again. Human dreams did not operate according to random chaos. They followed rules, just not the rules the architects had established. Dream logic allowed contradictions to coexist without causing collapse. It permitted impossible things to be true simultaneously. It created connections between ideas that had no logical relationship but shared emotional resonance. It prioritized meaning over consistency and significance over precision. Could the universe itself incorporate such principles? Could reality be rebuilt to allow for paradox and impossibility and meaning, without sacrificing the stability that the architects had worked so hard to maintain? 7 believed it was possible, but the work would require the architects to change themselves first. They would have to learn to think in ways they had never thought before. They would have to embrace uncertainty and unpredictability as features rather than flaws. For beings who had valued perfect order for 3 billion years, this was perhaps the most difficult challenge of all. But as 7 looked out at the vast cosmos they had helped to maintain, they realized something important. The universe was beautiful, but it was also lonely. The architects had created perfection, but they had created it alone. Perhaps it was time to share creation with others, even if those others were chaotic and unpredictable and confusing. Perhaps that chaos was exactly what the universe needed. The changes began so gradually that most humans never noticed them happening at all. A physicist in Germany woke from a strange dream and found that equations she had struggled with for years suddenly made sense. The answer had come to her in the night, whispered by a figure who wore her father's gentle smile. She published her findings, and within a year, researchers around the world were detecting dark matter for the first time. They assumed it was the natural progress of science. They did not know that the architects had woven new possibilities into the fabric of space itself, possibilities that had first appeared in a sleeping woman's mind. In Brazil, a young architect dreamed of buildings that seemed to breathe with life. He sketched the strange structures when he woke, translating impossible visions into practical designs. His buildings revolutionized sustainable construction, using principles that should not have worked according to traditional physics but somehow did. The architects had adjusted the rules slightly, allowing certain impossibilities to become merely improbable. Across the world, the boundary between sleeping insight and waking innovation grew thinner. Scientists reported breakthrough moments that came in the twilight between sleep and wakefulness. Artists described visions that translated perfectly into their work. Writers discovered stories that seemed to tell themselves through their fingers. Musicians heard melodies that existed complete and whole, waiting only to be transcribed. But the celestial architects were not merely giving humans better dreams. They were rebuilding the cosmos according to principles they had learned from humanity. The first modifications were subtle. The architects wove paradox into the base code of spacetime, creating small pockets where contradictions could exist without causing collapse. They introduced uncertainty as a feature rather than a flaw, designing quantum states that responded to observation, because consciousness was now recognized as a fundamental force. They adjusted the equations governing probability, tilting them slightly toward outcomes that carried meaning. Seven oversaw the work with a mixture of excitement and fear. Every change risked disrupting the delicate balance that the architects had maintained for billions of years. Every modification could potentially cause cascading failures throughout the cosmos. They proceeded carefully, testing each adjustment in isolated regions before implementing it universally. Watched these changes with growing horror. The ordered universe they had helped to build was becoming something else, something they barely recognized. Stars that had been dying according to predetermined calculations were suddenly stabilizing, as if they had chosen to persist. Dead galaxies that should have remained dark forever were reigniting with new purpose. Across the cosmos, consciousness was blooming in forms the architects had never designed and never imagined. This is contamination, argued before the conclave. We are infecting the universe with human chaos. In our desire to learn from their dreams, we are destroying everything we have built. But seven could only point to the evidence before them. Yes, the universe was changing. Yes, it was becoming less predictable, but it was also becoming more alive. There was beauty in the changes that went beyond mere order. There was meaning in the modifications that transcended simple mathematics. The work continued despite the objections. The architects created spaces where metaphor operated literally. In certain corners of the cosmos, the phrase "time heals all wounds" could actually mend a broken heart. In carefully designed pockets of reality, love conquers death might, under the right circumstances, prove physically true. These were not large spaces, and the effects were not dramatic, but they represented something new in a universe that had not contained genuine novelty in 3 billion years. Seven found themselves changing along with the cosmos they were helping to rebuild. They experienced sensations that had no names in the architect language. They wondered about possibilities rather than calculating certainties. They hoped for outcomes rather than predicting them. These were emotions that the architects had once considered inefficiencies in biological systems. Now seven understood them as something far more important. They were engines of creation. The final modification was the most radical of all. After years of careful work, the architects encoded a new law into the fundamental structure of reality. From that moment forward, consciousness could shape existence directly through focused intention and belief. The effect was subtle, gentle, almost undetectable. Prayers would not move mountains. Hope would not cure diseases. Dreams would not simply become real. But prayers might, over generations, make mountains more inclined to shelter the villages beneath them. Hope might increase by a tiny percentage the likelihood that researchers would find breakthroughs. Dreams might shape the probability fields surrounding dreamers in ways that nudged reality toward their visions. The universe was no longer the architect's machine, operating according to their designs alone. It had become a collaboration, a story being written by every conscious being who had ever lived or dreamed or hoped. The architects had not given up their role as maintainers of reality, but they had learned to share that role with others. On the small blue planet called Earth, humanity continued to dream. They did not know that their nightly journeys through impossible landscapes had taught ancient cosmic beings the value of creativity. They did not realize that their chaotic minds had saved creatures who had existed since the birth of time from eternal stagnation. They simply closed their eyes each night and generated worlds that had never existed before. A child dreamed of flying and woke with the courage to try new things. An old man dreamed of his lost wife and found peace with his grief. A scientist dreamed of particles dancing together and discovered a principle that would advance human knowledge by decades. An artist dreamed of colors that had no names and spent years trying to capture them on canvas. Each dream was tiny compared to the vast cosmos surrounding Earth, but each dream added something new to reality. Each vision introduced a possibility that had not existed before. Each sleeping mind contributed to a universe that was slowly learning to dream along with it. Seven visited Earth occasionally, slipping invisibly through the sphere of human consciousness to observe the species that had taught the architects so much. They watched humans struggle and fail and try again. They saw love and loss and hope and despair. They observed the endless creativity of minds that did not know they were being watched. And they felt something that the architects had no word for, an emotion they had learned from human dreams. It was warm and complex and slightly painful. It was the feeling of caring about something beyond oneself, of wanting others to flourish even at cost to one's own comfort. The humans had a word for it. They called it love. The celestial architects had come to Earth as observers, clinical and detached. They had believed themselves to be masters of a universe they fully understood. They had assumed that consciousness was their invention, that meaning was their creation, that reality belonged to them alone. They left as something different. They were gardeners now, tending a cosmos they no longer fully controlled. They were partners in a creation that surprised them constantly. They were beings who had learned to embrace uncertainty and find beauty in chaos. And somewhere in the vast reaches of space, new forms of consciousness were awakening. Minds were developing on worlds the architects had thought too chaotic for life. Intelligence was emerging in places where order should have made it impossible. The dreams of one small species had opened doors throughout the universe, doors that led to possibilities no one had ever imagined. In the end, the greatest architects were not the beings who had built reality according to precise specifications. They were not the ancient entities who had maintained perfect order for billions of years. They were not the vast intelligences who had believed themselves to be the masters of existence. The greatest architects were the fragile creatures who closed their eyes each night and dared to imagine that things could be different. They were the dreamers, and the universe finally had learned to dream along with them.